InfraTalk. It's yet another edition, and I'm really looking forward to today's topic. The InfraTalk as of today has been organized by the NFDI for Inch consortium, and we are always very grateful for our partners to organize these talks. And as for today, it is a great pleasure to welcome members of the DataCite team, along with a member from the TIB, and I'm going to present all of them shortly. So along with us is Matthew Buys. He's the Executive Director of DataCite. He's based in Amsterdam, and he focuses on building DataCite into a sustainable global community, as his CV say. Previously, he has gathered experiences as a Director of Engagement at ORCID, so PIDs seem like a common interest for a longer time now for Matt. And so I think it's quite nice that Matt and his team present as of today. Along with Matt, you will find Britta Dreyer. She works as a business manager for DataCite and manages the DataCite business office. Previously, she was pursuing a PhD from, not a PhD, sorry, an MBA from the University of Applied Sciences and Arts in Hanover. So her current stay in Hanover seems to be a continuation of the location as well, but also along with her interests in research. Her fields of work include human resources, marketing, and process optimization. And last but not least, we have Paul Vierkant, who happens to be the outreach manager of DataCite. And he is contributing to, for example, DFG-funded projects such as Registry data, which is quite well known in the scenery, COREF and Orchid ID. So also a strong interest in PID research. Prior to that, Paul worked at the Helmholtz Open Science Office, and it seems there's a connection to ORCID as well. So probably PIDs also are a quite interesting or quite prominent topic in his life for quite some time now. And last but not least, we welcome Irina Sens, who is the Deputy Director at the TIB Hanover. And the TIB Hanover has a strong connection to DataCite, as you all will probably know. She has pursued a PhD some time ago from the Philipp University of Marburg, and it was interesting for me also to learn that she has a PhD in chemistry. So that's Irina's actual topic. But now for a long time, she's heading and co-heading the TIB. The topic as for today is the role of persistent identifiers and the PID-Graph for NFDI. And as you know, the FAIR principles somehow built on the existence and the application of PIDs, that's persistent identifiers. And today we have PIDs for many things. We have PIDs for authors, such as DOIs. We have PIDs for datasets, sometimes also DOIs. We have PIDs publications was the first one with DOIs, and for persons, it's ORCID IDs, of course. We also have organizations, that's the ROR IDs, and I'm still looking for the right PIDs for software. I'm looking forward to your talk. I'm very much looking forward to learning more about the PID graph, and the floor is yours. Thanks for being here for today.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I'll begin talking while Britta, if you can bring up the slides and share the screen, that'll be great. It's really great to have an opportunity to talk to you all today, and really looking forward to the engaging component at the end, where we have an opportunity for questions and to also learn about some perspectives and talk to you. As mentioned, I'll talk briefly about the persistent identifier graph and the role of relational metadata. Paul will speak briefly about some of our initiatives and projects that we are involved in. And then finally, Britta will close with some of the current status and things that we collectively as a community need to focus on together to move forwards. So I'll jump right in. Britta, if you can go to the next slide. So one of the things that I always like to start off with is that today's research allows for tomorrow's discoveries. And so as a persistent identifier infrastructure service provider, we see it really important that we serve a foundational role in the community to enable open access to the results of research, to ensure that we can disseminate and reuse research, and that we build trust in the community. Trust is a really important pillar within our community that we need to work around and build on. We also want to allow for the recognition of the impact of research and the reuse of research outputs, and this is across the board, all of the facets of research and the research lifecycle. We want to be able to preserve the research data that is used in studies, and we want to make sure that collectively as a community, we support bringing more rigor to the scholarly record of the research that is conducted. Next slide, please, Britta. One of the important concepts that I like to focus on is that we do not speak exclusively about persistent identifiers. It's really important that metadata and the services that are built around the metadata and these persistent identifiers is more important, in fact, than just the PIDs. A PID alone with low quality or no metadata really serves only the purpose of unique identification. And that is, I maybe will acknowledge that that is a use case that we have in the community, but it's important that we have metadata alongside the persistent identifiers so that we can serve these downstream use cases, and that we can allow for the traversing and understanding or traversing of systems and metadata across these systems to understand impact, allow for reuse. One example, a simple example, would be licensing information within a persistent identifier metadata allows the community to understand what rights they have to that research data, as an example. So we need to ensure that we coordinate within the broader PID ecosystem, and Paul will talk a bit about this in some of the related initiatives and projects that we are involved in. There's a lot of these, so Paul will focus on a few today, but really ensuring that we have relations in the metadata. Next slide, please. We know that research is a graph, and so we know that a publication has authors. We know that generally there's a data set of sorts. We know that there's software used. And so we know that this graph exists, and the idea of a persistent identifier graph is that we are able to use persistent identifiers and the metadata and enable a service, being the GraphQL API, to allow for us to traverse and understand the relationships between these different objects within this graph. Next slide, please. And so through persistent identifier metadata, we are able to understand the relation between A and B, as an example. So we can understand that these authors authored this paper, as an example. But we may not be able to understand that these authors authored this publication, being B, that used this data set from a different group of researchers, which is C. And so by building this into a persistent identifier graph, we are able to now understand at least 2 hops away, and there's more power in building this out further. But using enhanced technology such as GraphQL, we are able to run single queries within the API and understand these types of more complex relationships within the research that is conducted. Next slide, please. So one of the key things is to ensure that we have relational metadata. And so if we talk about relational metadata between 2 research outputs, so it could be a piece of software in a data set, as an example, we can put in relations. We can also put in citations or references, as an example, between a paper and a data set. We could also have a relation between, say, a DMP ID. So we launched with dmptool.org. IDs for DMPs, and we could describe the relationship between those different objects within the DMP ID. And so it's really important that we as a community and the communities that are registering the metadata within the persistent identifiers are making sure that these relations are visible. We're also exploring as DataCite different opportunities and different sources to extend and enrich the metadata across the community so that we can provide more value to our members about the relations between their identifiers and other identifiers out there. And this is not exclusive to any persistent identifier type. It's across persistent identifiers and bringing these together. Next slide, please. One thing that I like to reinforce is that we see the PIDGraph as a community resource, that it is possible for communities to build services on top of this. And so you'll see that DataCite has DataCite Commons, which is a user interface that is built on top of the PIDGraph, but it's not the PIDGraph itself. It's possible for community stakeholders to build interfaces or build services on top of the PIDGraph, or even interact with something like a knowledge graph, as an example, to bring in that metadata around the persistent identifiers into maybe a knowledge graph workflow to understand more about the knowledge and research produced. And so we see this as a community resource, building together an ecosystem and serving downstream use cases that we have across disciplines, across domains. We developed this GraphQL API during the Freya project. And this was the most convenient way for us to be able to consume the PIDGraph metadata, but allow for the community with a very simple query, a single query, generate a lot of information out of that. And so we see the PIDGraph as a resource for the community, which is really a known query search. So within the graph, you would be able to say, I know this identifier, so I know, let's say, this organizational identifier, so I use a raw ID, and give me the related research outputs to this. Or could you tell me the related research outputs to this data set, or this piece of software, tell me the related output. So across people, places, things, if you know an identifier, you could run a query. Next slide, please. The related identifier property is really important. So this is made, most of these connections are made using the related identifier property. I say most of the connections because when I say this, I'm talking about the relations between objects, research objects, so say a DMP or a piece of software or a data set or an article, relations between people and places being organizations is two different fields within the schema, but just calling that out here. And then these are identified in our event data service, which makes relations between these. We also allow for globally unique identifiers such as DOIs, handles, URLs, URNs, IDSNs, archives to be incorporated within the PIDGraph. And having this related identifier information is really helpful for following this trail of research. Next slide, please. One example, and this is a very simple visualization, and we have planned work to do a bit more work around enhancing these visualizations. But on the screen, you see one of the Jupyter notebooks that we developed with the DMP tool team. This is a DMP ID, and we can see the people that were involved in this data management plan. We can see the data sets that came out of this group's research. We can see the publications, can also see the funders involved, and we can also see the institutional affiliation of these researchers. And so this is one example. Within the Freya project, I think when we initially built out the use cases, there were probably 50 to 100, and I think there's no limit on that. When we get together as a community, there's so many different downstream use cases that we could serve, and this is where the GraphQL API, the PIDGraph, really can add value to the community. The next slide, please. One more example I wanted to show is the DataCite Commons interface, which is built on top of the PIDGraph. This is our search and discovery interface at DataCite. This will be our primary search and discovery interface when we retire DataCite Search at the end of this year. So we're putting more effort into improving this interface and technology. Still lots of work to be done. But within this interface, as an example, we could query a specific data set. We can also start bringing in information such as citations, views and downloads. So as an example, Zenodo and Dreyer, Figshare also started doing this, is through a usage log processing, adding counter compliance usage information into the persistent identifier infrastructure and making that available for reuse across the community. So that information can also come into the PIDGraph as well. And the next slides. The final slide, I just wanted to mention that get involved. We don't do this alone. We're a community. We work together. We want to make sure that we are grounded in our approach as we move forwards and validate everything that we do. So working together on collaborative activities that we collectively want to improve scholarly infrastructure, making sure that use cases are prominent, that we talking about what we're trying to serve and who are the community and the stakeholders that we're trying to serve. And being able to show the benefits to all involved. If you have ideas about the evolution of the PIDGraph or just generally about data sites, feel free to email us. We also have our public roadmap, which has various cards available. You can see what's up for consideration. You'll see various comments there. You can also go track those, fill in surveys there. And if you go track or like a particular card, you'll also be notified via email as that progresses along. So we really do appreciate any input that you have and look forward to hearing from you. I'll now hand over to Paul. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, Matt. Today I will talk about the three projects, ORCID, eCarve, and RAW that DataCite is involved in, as Matt already said. And to start with ORCID, next slide, please. I first have to introduce what is ORCID all about. So ORCID stands for Open Research and Contributor ID. That's basically a persistent identifier that is an alphanumeric code for the unique identification of a researcher. And I guess you will have those slides afterwards, so you can check out the example here at the link. There are over 11 million already ORCID IDs in the world, and that is, they have been issued since 2012 when the whole registry started. And focusing on Germany, we can say that we currently have 240,000 ORCID IDs in Germany. Next slide, please. Then what is ORCID? So the organization behind the ORCID ID. ORCID is an international consortium or non-profit organization that consists over and is financed by over 1,200 members that are publishers, research funders, and research institutions from countries all over the world. So the goal is of ORCID is to make the ORCID IDs persistent and findable, and for researchers, those to register an ORCID ID is free of charge. So you can go on this website and register your ORCID ID. And this ORCID ID is linked to your personal ORCID record. So what you can see here on the screenshot is a screenshot of my ORCID record that you can see online. It may look like a social profile, but it's what ORCID stresses always is that it's an ORCID record, not an ORCID profile, because it really covers much more than just other social networking platforms that there are also in the academic realm, because they are fed by other PIDs such as DOIs or RAWs, as we will see later. Next slide, please. Then why would I need an ORCID ID is a legit question. So there are many reasons for that. First of all, it's all about this ambiguation of personal names, because like in every kind of culture or language, there might be a kind of clustering of names due to historic reasons or cultural reasons. Here we have an example of 11 Wongs as part of as authors of one paper, but we also have Meyer, Müller, Schmidt in Germany. So it's getting really difficult to distinguish between people and to give credit to the right people for their research output. So in case of name equivalent, name changes, different spellings or abbreviations, this is where the persistent identifier comes in place. Next slide, please. And not only these challenges exist for the researchers themselves, but all the other stakeholders in the academic realm do have these challenges of identifying these individuals. So it's publishers, funders, and academic institutions alike that really want to identify that very person and not to confuse people with the same name. So researchers have, might have, if they don't have ORCID ID have incomplete overviews of the actual research activities, which you can have in your ORCID record. You have a much higher administrative effort for creating such a publication list or list for reporting and other project-related publication coverage for funding agencies. And on the other hand, the research institutions might have difficulties to benchmark their organizations against others based on the overall research output that there is of the institution. And then again, just like the researchers, but on an institutional level, they have difficulties to identify, track, and report the research output of the researchers. So at the end, it boils down to entering the same metadata, the metadata of the same publication several times in different systems. It's not really, shouldn't be the goal. So this is what ORCID solves. Next slide, please. And there comes the mantra of ORCID, enter once, reuse often. So you see an example like one researcher is in the middle and his ORCID or her ORCID record is connected to different kind of other systems that always reuse the data that was entered once. For instance, if the researcher submitted a manuscript to a publisher and that is published, and then the funder, because of the ORCID ID that is published along in the metadata with the article, goes to the funder, so that the publication is linked also to the funder, so that the funder really knows what where the money went into which kind of project or publication or research output. The same goes for the employer. Thanks. Next slide. And yeah, so often comes the question, I already do have other IDs, so why would I need an ORCID ID? This is also a good question. First of all, the ORCID ID is an open ID. It's not a proprietary or commercial ID that there are already a lot of in the world, but it's an open ID that was initiated by a global non-for-profit organization, ORCID. Then a lot of institutions implement ORCID in their systems, and researchers directly benefit from ORCID and its the advantages that come along with it, being pre-filled forms that fill out, if you submit a manuscript or something like that. And ORCID is compatible with many systems of publishers and research funders and academic institutions. And this is where really there's an advantage of ORCID over other proprietary systems that may not be compatible or interoperable. Then the ORCID ID can be linked to those aforementioned other IDs, like the Web of Science Research ID or Scopus Author ID, so that these systems really work together, and that's really an advantage of ORCID. Researchers at the same have control over all their data in their ORCID record at all times, and that is really a plus, so to say, for ORCID, because they really care about data privacy. Maybe next slide, then I can elaborate a little bit more on that. Yes, and even data sovereignty. So it's a core principle of ORCID and their ORCID Trust program to keep the author or the researcher keeps the sovereignty over their data. And obviously also ORCID is GDPR compliant. And this is just to give you a hint on what is possible, or what kind of options researchers have with the ORCID record, is that they could have granular visibility settings that they can really adjust to whatever they want for all the works, for employment, for education, and their biographical sections, that they can set these visibility settings to either everyone, so the public, trusted parties that may be trusted individuals like colleagues, or the institutions that this person is affiliated with, or only me, like only the author, him or herself. Next slide. Now, finally, we get to ORCID DE. So ORCID DE is a DFG-funded project that wants to promote the implementation and use of ORCID in Germany by doing a lot of outreach events, blogging. We set up a mailing list, provide outreach material, and consult academic institutions in Germany on the topic of ORCID and how they implement this the ORCID ID into their systems. We give talks and workshops and webinars in order to help institutions implementing ORCID, and that approach, that project-assisted approach, is a real success story compared to other countries. So yeah, maybe Britta later will elaborate a little bit more on the consortium that we have. But yes, so far, like we have implemented ORCID in the Bielefeld academic search engine base, and also connected it to the German authority file GND. And we're data side. My work package within the project is to work on organizational identifiers. Next slide, please. That's it for ORCID. Now we get to Re3 data. That is a global registry for research data repositories. So far, we have 2,500 repositories, and that project started in 2012, so fairly old in that sense, and it covers all academic disciplines. So there's no real focus on MINT subjects or humanities. There, it covers every kind of discipline that there is, and that registry shall help researchers find a proper place for permanent storage and also access to research data sets in these respective portals or research data repositories, and also not only for researchers but also for funding bodies and publishers and academic institutions, and shall in general, like the overall goal is to promote the culture of sharing, increase access, and better visibility of research data. Next slide, please. And here you can see a screenshot of a list of results that you can have. You can see it's even more than 2,700 repositories, and with basic descriptions, but it has a real, like there's a lot of information within a detailed view, a landing page of each repository, because they're like about 50 metadata fields. So very complex description that is also visualized in the icon set that you can see on the very right. So people can at first glance see what kind of character traits this repository or what kind of technologies it supports. Next slide, please. Within Re3 Data CoreGraph, that is the third project so far that the DFG funded for Re3 Data, we have 5 work packages. They are developing a conceptual service model that focuses on making the service more reusable for other stakeholders. Like, for instance, if there was a group or institution that wanted to have their own list, a subset of repositories, they could really via an API reuse that data for themselves. We update the metadata schema that I just mentioned because it has grown old and everything needs an update once in a while. We need to update the technical infrastructure to really implement what we say that we would, what the service that we want to deliver. We had just ended a quality and transparency survey about the quality aspect of research data. And we obviously also do community building in Germany, but also beyond. Next slide. Yeah, last topic is the Research Organization Registry, ROR, another registry. This time it's all about organizational identifiers, so IDs for organizations or research organizations and the respective metadata. What is interesting about ROR is that ROR is not an organization in itself. It's a multi-organization collaboration. So it's a different kind of approach in order to leverage the power that we have as like the stakeholders involved, DataCite, Crossref, California Digital Library, in order to provide such an open science service as ROR. And the focus of ROR is to give or to provide a solution for the affiliation use case that if somebody wants to describe or name its affiliation, then ROR would be the ID to choose the ROR idea. So it's developed by, with, and for the community. We have a lot of working groups and also a steering group that really makes it a community-driven collaboration or organization. It's open and non-commercial as our ORCID and dataset as well. And yeah, with that raw ID, you can connect organizations to researchers and their research outputs. Currently, there is a mixed funding model that consists of in-kind support for raw or like DataCite and Crossref commit themselves as does the California Digital Library, but also grants that we currently have 2 grants. In the future, we are thinking about having an optional paid service tier that is will be there in 2022. The registry data, however, will always be open and free. Next slide, please. This is what a screenshot of the registry itself, the entry of the California Digital Library. That has a very basic metadata set where the website is, the name, the raw ID itself, which is the URL that you can see below the orange beam. And then you have also the other identifiers to which this raw ID is linked to. So always we keep in mind what Matt already mentioned to interlink the current identifiers with other systems. Next slide, please. This is how it could look like. This is an implementation of the research data repository Dreyer. A person, an author wants to submit some research data and wants to also name his or her affiliation and just types in the name, and then he or she gets suggested the respective or affiliation or institution with the correct spelling and the correct name. Yes, next slide, please. And this is what it could look like. A researcher selects his or her affiliation from the list, the journal, not only data, but also for research articles. This is valid. The journal checks for competing interests because of the affiliation. The paper is published with the affiliation, and so the raw is within the metadata, and that is deposited in Crossref that supports raw, and so does DataCite and will ORCID in the future. Next slide. And here's one of the results that we had found out in the Orchid ID project about organizational identifiers that I mentioned. And this gives you kind of a hint what is going on in the future in terms of organizational identifiers. The question was, which organizational identifiers do you use? And the answer, which shows this graph, is we're not using it currently, but we're planning to do so. And it clearly shows that raw is the horse that you should bet on, at least in Germany and I guess worldwide. So with this, I'll leave it to Britta. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. So in the last 10 minutes of this presentation, I will take you to a current status or an overview of the current state of the PID infrastructure in Germany. And before I start, I would like to point out that Germany has actually done pioneers work here in this area and has registered this first DUI that you see on my first slide here in 2005, I believe, in the course of a DFG-funded project. It's a DUI for a data set published by the German Climate Data Center in Hamburg. So we basically started this, and on this second slide here, you see now in this table the current German DataCite members. There are 10 of them that are registering DUIs for many years now, and then highlighted in blue-greenish, there are also 5 consortia in Germany which have combined 150 members, which are also research organizations in Germany. So all of them are registering or have registered in total around about 2.9 million DUIs for different research artifacts. And you see here in this graphic very easily. From these 2.9 million DUIs, 55% have been registered for data sets, 29% for audiovisual material, for text publications. I'm sorry, that's a similar green, and 9% of the DUIs have been registered for books and other material. Books we just recently added to our resource type general list in our standardized metadata schema. So the data site metadata schema is a standardized schema, and that's applied across the DUI registering organizations across the world. There are currently 250 members worldwide, working with 2,500 repositories. So they're all using this data site metadata schema. So I'm sharing the slides, so I have to move your pictures away a little bit so I can see the statistics. And I wanted to show you that these 55% data sets that have been registered by German research organizations, you know, almost, half of it belong to Pangea, which is not really surprising. Pangea has been registering DUIs for data sets since the beginning. You probably all know Pangea. And then 30% have been registered by ZBMed, but here mostly by a Leibniz Center for Cell Cultures. So they have registered, I think, almost 80% of the DUIs, and 19% of the DUIs have been registered by the 103 remaining members of the TIB DUI consortium, which is also not very surprising because we are, these consortia are organized subject specific. So TIB is working with the natural sciences or also, of course, environmental sciences, and they have been always very, they have a data sharing culture that they have been, registering DUIs for many years now. And except, well, they're all subject specific, except the Hochschulbibliothekszentrum for Nordrhein-Westfalen. That's a local consortium supporting Nordrhein-Westfalen. I also wanted to give you a brief overview of the research software that has been registered with DUIs. So there is only thus far 445 DUIs registered for software in Germany in total by all of the research organizations you have seen in the table and the consortia. So, but you see there is a need here, a Zenodo, that is a generic repository offered to researchers. So researchers upload here their data sets, which are they're publishing with their research articles, or there's also an integration I'd like to point out with GitHub. And when you write software code in GitHub, there is a way that you can just press a button and then publish that software code with the DUI within GitHub, and the code is then a screenshot of the code is archived in Zenodo. So you could probably do this with any other platform I know in NFDI you're using GitLab, so there would be probably a potential here to make research software citable and reusable by the research community. And you see that Zenodo has registered in total 182,000 DUIs for research software. And here you see in the bar on the right, that has been increasingly so since 2014. We recognize that, and Professor Zurfetter mentioned it in the beginning, that the metadata of these persistent identifiers make research fair, and the DOI metadata supports the FAIR principles. And so we ask ourselves at the TIB consortium, how much or to which extent is the metadata fields that are commonly used by our repositories supporting the FAIR principles? How fair are the DOI metadata sets? And where do we need improvement, information, and more support? And are there best practice examples? So these were the research questions we wanted to answer with an metadata analysis. And this is only taken the repositories that register DOIs within the TIB DOI consortium. So we took these 144 TIB DataCite repositories. I mean, these have integrations built with the DataCite platform, are registering DOIs via API or the web interface Fabrica, and 72 repositories register with less than 300 DOIs are fully covered here, and 72 repositories with quite a bit more than 300 DOIs in total. We took a selection, and this collection was done via the DataCite public API. And the status of the data is November of last year. And we had help of Ted Haberman with the metadata game changers. And I just wanted to show you a summary view here. He basically split the metadata fields into 4 categories. And there are metadata fields that support the FAIR findable essential. You see this graphic on the top left, mostly mandatory bibliographic metadata that you need to submit with the DOI registrations. So you see that there's a lot of blue in this circle. So they are, of course, submitted with each DOI registration. And in this average, we took 190 records. The calculation is down here, so to make sure that we have a good sample. Then there are the second category, FAIR findable support. There are some further metadata fields included here that support further support the findability of the metadata and the resources. So there you see the resource type. Now also a mandatory field is, there you see a nice blue arrow, and the author type, you also see a nice blue arrow. But all the other fields where in metadata descriptions, you see there is still room for improvement. The same is for the FAIR AIR essentials and the FAIR support, which support the other principles that support accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. You see, sometimes there is a rights URL part of the metadata, and it was not so simple to take this example here, because there are repositories that really do best practice, and they register quite a few DOIs. So there is, I mean, as you can see here, there is room for improvement overall. And this will support the fairness of the metadata overall. And yes, adding other PIDs like ORCIDs, RAWs, and funder IDs, you've heard this in Matt's part of the presentation, they are critical to really make this PID-Graph work and to increase the utility across the entire network, PID network and research network overall. What I have done in a second query, I've basically now stepped away from this TIB sample. I went back to the table with all the 10 direct data site members and the consortia, and I took a look at their metadata and how they're filling the metadata fields. So, for example, I queried here how many ORCID IDs have been added to the metadata. And you see there are 7% of all DUI metadata records of these 2.9 million DUIs that have been registered include an ORCID ID. My number is a little bit lower than Paul's, but yeah, there are quite a few registered in Germany. So it's either researchers don't submit these ORCID IDs at the point of publication of their data sets or text publications, or they're just not being entered into the metadata record. And then you see the affiliation scheme. I queried here if an affiliation scheme has been used, and you see only 1%. But you've all noticed that there is a bright star on the sky. Paul said that most research organizations are indeed eager to implement RAW in their metadata. So, and then, similar results came up with related identifiers. So related identifiers, as Matt has said, build relations between research output. And the most frequently used were has part or is part. That is mainly used to describe a collection. So a collection may consist of several data sets. For example, an experiment with many data sets. So you would connect all of them to a collection. That is one frequently used use case. And has metadata. So often domain-specific metadata is here linked in the metadata, the DUI generic metadata, to ensure the reusability of the data set by enabling the visibility or the look at other further domain-specific metadata that is important for reuse. Yeah, and a subject, 37% of all the 2.9 registered DUIs include a subject. So that makes it really difficult. I've been asked frequently, so what do you think? How many, which fields, which domains are implementing these PIDs? And yeah, it's hard to answer that question if the subject area is not entered into the DUI metadata. And we do recommend the OECD standard as a high-level subject type that really helps and already brings a lot of benefit and leaves room, of course, for other specific standards and schemas that can be entered into the metadata. Well, at the end of my presentation, I would like to point out that overall, we're on a really good path in Germany. You see that the DUI registrations in the left graphic are increasing extremely in 2020. So you would, I mean, it's always a little bit difficult to say, because sometimes when a new organization joins, they will register quite a few DUIs for backlog, or sometimes there are big projects that generate lots of DUIs. And so you see that here there's a steep increase in 2020. And I think that NFDI as a central approach can really be a great support here. And then you see the ORCID DE consortium. Paul mentioned that we do have a consortium here in Germany. We currently have 70 members. Yeah, so these are the same organizations that all register DUIs. So we have a nice group to support here in the PID service at TIB, where we provide also lots of information and guidelines, and a German data site Fabrica handbook. So you see a link here. And yeah, you see that continuously we are basically adding one new member to the ORCID consortium per month. And I would like to point out the link on the right. So if you have an interest or a question, please go on the website and submit an inquiry of interest or a question or whatever you have. You'll get an email on the same day. So that is a great place to go if you're interested in integrating ORCID in your organization. Yes, so I think we have now 10 or 8 minutes for questions.
Thanks to all the speakers for giving the very nice presentation and overview, also highlighting numbers and some insights to the current and recent development. I thought it was really good talk. Thank you very much. I'd like to hand over now to Eva Lübke. She will moderate the rest of our session.
Thank you, Jörg, and thank you to the presentators of today's talk. I also want to thank you for your for both providing the big picture, but also very valuable insights. And in case you have a question, please type a W in the chat, or if you feel more comfortable with typing down the question, of course, this is also very fine for us. There are no questions at the moment. And there was a small discussion in the chat already, but I think this question was solved already. So I see that Jörg has a question, so please go ahead.
As always, I have a number of questions in petto. An obvious first question. Thanks for showing the recent numbers from 2020 for DOI registrations on one of your final slides. And the jump was about 200,000 DOIs. Is that correct? Roughly?
That is correct. That was a steep increase, yes.
That's awesome. I was wondering, do you have some first insights from what kind of domains the registered digital objects do come from? And of course, the most obvious follow-up question, is there a link to COVID-19 question mark?
Well, that's a great question. I think Matt will answer the COVID-19 part. I don't want to put you on the spot, Matt, but I'm happy to share some further insights to where the steep increase comes from. But I know of one organization, the AIP, the Astrophysics Institute in Potsdam. They have registered quite a lot of images for their giant project. Okay. But I'm happy to look further into it. But they have just about 200,000 DOIs registered for that, and planning to register millions for stars they have discovered. So there are lots of DOIs coming for astrophysics, I would say, to the research discipline. That is mostly active here. And of course, environmental sciences, and the cell cultures database, the German database of cell cultures I mentioned with ZBMed, they are registering also quite many DOIs. And social sciences and humanities are really active, but they don't have that many data sets or research output coming from that community.
And we can, if it's helpful, I mean, we can go look into this. Again, it comes back to metadata because, things like subject fields are sometimes, optional and left out, so we don't always know, but we can do some form of analysis, obviously, we know what certain domains the repositories are within, and we can track that in some way. So we can give some indication. It won't be completely conclusive necessarily because it's not the full picture, but we could give an indication and have a look in our database and then try give some sort of indication of the domains and having a look at that. With COVID, again, I wouldn't draw any direct or statistical correlation maybe, but anecdotally, we did see a lot of interest and uptake of data site services in biomedical research and sort of general communities that are very involved in COVID-19 research and really trying to make visibility of research data. We've also seen an increased interest from the open pharma community, so the pharmaceutical companies really trying to push on getting a step further than just data availability statements and actually making data open. And I hope that we can make some more progress with some of the private sectors in that regard as well.
Thank you for this information. I mean, this is a big step for a lot of companies. So it's great to see this development. Jan Brase has a question.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I just want to say that it's great to see how the identifiers are evolving and that they are used and the great progress that DataCite is doing, and also the ORCID community. I was just wondering that from your presentation, it's pretty obvious that it would be great if we could use persistent identifiers, ideally DOIs, for all research data that is created in the in the NFDIs. But I see the problem is of costs involved, and I just want to remember and remind us that 5-10 years ago, we had the idea that that identifiers and DOIs would be part of infrastructure, and that infrastructure institutions would assign DOIs free of charge for the regular researcher. The current DataCite model now supports that every data center has to become a member of DataCite, and that there now are more costs involved with DOIs. And I was just wondering, is DataCite considering to support especially the NFDI structure? Because I think that with this interesting pilot of NFDIs, it would be great to have more use of DOIs and identifiers. And I'm still skeptical about the cost, because currently no NFDI can actually afford to assign DOIs to all data because the costs are not scalable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as you know, we work on a pure cost recovery model. And so we did a detailed cost-based model, and there are infrastructures that are supported by grant funding continuation. And so we implemented a consortium model with various fee caps that works on a sustained cost recovery. And really, this is to protect the investment of infrastructure, and that you invest services and tooling around the infrastructure. And we want to make sure that registration of identifiers is persistent and sustainable forever in perpetuity. And so it's really important to have a strong cost recovery model. And so there was an adjustment in the model on the basis that DataCite wasn't sustainable. If we continued on that model, DataCite would no longer be sustainable, and all of the organizations investing time and effort and technology into that would have lost that investment. And so it was really important to make that. That being said, there are other conduits and ways that we've been working with organizations, and we're open to, yeah, always. We've had various conversations in, like, the NSF as an example in the US. We're very active talking to them with their public access repository and limiting barriers. There shouldn't be any barriers for any particular researcher that wants a DOI. There's open domain repositories where it doesn't cost anything to get a DOI, but also different tools and different solutions that we can provide. And so I think in the context of the NFDI, I think it's really important to look at a cross-domain services that supports the different consortia, and then also the relation into the European Open Science Cloud, into EASC. And so we are also a core partner in some of the projects, DICE being one, and so there's funded EU opportunities for organizations to register DOIs that are funded by the European Commission. There's also various basic services that will come into the next round of calls that are launched next year, and so DataCite is also part of that. Again, that relates into our model. It's still sticks to our sustainability model, but it is funded centrally. And so I think that's something that we definitely should continue conversations on, and it really is important for us. Our fundamental objective is making sure that infrastructure is sustainable for the community.
Okay, thank you for providing this information about how you are dealing with the cost structure and the sustainability of providing the services. Jörg has a question, and given the time, this would be like the last question before closing the question section. But as you all know, we have the tradition of an after talk session. So if you want to discuss more in detail, you can go to the after talk event. The link will be posted in the chat section, and it was also posted in the invitation. And now, Jörg, your question.
Thanks for the privilege for a second question. Here's a technical question. Now I know that that there are various ways of dealing with versions of data sets, for example. And I know that at least some people try to keep the versions out of the DOIs, and some other people are trying to encode version numbers into DOIs. Is there, in the meantime, something like a best practice emerged from that? And if so, what is the best practice? And follow-up question is, do you have some kind of idea how good at the moment the choices of the data registering persons lead to the reproducibility idea? Because essentially, you need to know with which kind of data set exactly an experiment has been conducted. So you need to know the version number. Now, if you only have the DOI, then it's of course quite crucial to have the version number included, or you have the additional information about the version, right? And that depends on the best practice on how you are dealing with that. Do you have any insights which you may want to share?
So it's a difficult question to answer in a short period, but I'll try my best and give them Britta and Paul feel free to jump in. But I think, so there is, we do think that having an opaque identifier is also something that's good, because then we focus more on the metadata, and then within the metadata, we can have a related identifier is version of, as an example. I would say that we haven't reached any specific convergence across domains and disciplines, because there's different practices and different ways to do this. So I can't actually give a very clear steer on this is the way to do it and this is the right way, because we still do see it happening both ways from our members. It is possible, obviously, the identifier, you can put that in there, but we do feel that we should focus on the metadata as opposed to focusing too much on trying to deduce meaning from the actual identifier itself. And so maybe I'll pose that. And I think this is also, again, something that across the NFDI and the consortia, we can really sort of work at best practice and defining this a bit. Obviously, we involved, across different regions, but really finding that common ground is important. I don't know, Britta and Paul, if you want to briefly add anything.
Well, I'm posting a link in the chat to our best practices on our support pages, basically restating what Matt just had said. And I have to agree. I also see that domains have their specific needs, and we do recommend what Matt has said to include the versioning into the DOI metadata in the related identifier field to make that visible also in the PID-Graph. It makes a lot of sense to be in there.
All right, thanks for the quick answers. Looking forward to more in-depth discussions later.
Yeah, thank you for this very comprising form of answering this question, this big question. So I'm happy for closing today's, again, very interesting talk. And you are invited to our after talk. Next InfraTalk will take place in September. The August, as you all know, is the month of holidays and like the summer break. So we appreciate with starting again in September with Professor Irina. And we We appreciate your participation for joining this talk and in Zoom, but also on YouTube. And yes, so thank you for giving the presentations and this exchange.
Bye, and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
all. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.